You think you know this road. You've seen it in paintings, in films, in stained glass windows where the light falls just right and everything looks like sorrow made beautiful. You've watched the procession move slowly across polished screens, the crowd frozen in cinematic grief, the path clean and dramatic and somehow bearable to look at. But that road was not beautiful, and most people who stood along it that morning did not understand what they were witnessing. They did not have subtitles. They did not have 2,000 years of theology explaining the weight of what was passing in front of them. They had dust. They had noise. They had a body breaking under wood. And they had fear. The particular kind of fear that comes when Roman soldiers are close, and the crowd is loud, and no one is entirely sure how the morning is going to end. To understand what happened on the road to Golgotha, you have to understand Jerusalem in the year 33 AD, not the Jerusalem of devotional imagination, the real one, the one that smelled of livestock and smoke and unwashed stone and the particular thickness of a city holding far too many people inside walls built for far fewer. It was Passover week. That detail alone changes everything, because Passover was not a quiet religious observance. It was the largest population event in the ancient Jewish calendar, a mandatory pilgrimage that drew hundreds of thousands of people from across Judea, Galilee, the diaspora, from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome itself. Josephus, the first-century historian, recorded numbers that modern scholars debate but none dismiss entirely. Jerusalem, a city whose permanent population hovered somewhere between 60 and 100,000, swelled during Passover to nearly 3 times that size. If this kind of historical reconstruction is something that strengthens your faith and sharpens how you read the Gospels, consider subscribing to this channel. This is exactly the kind of journey we take together, week after week, one forgotten detail at a time. Think about what that means physically. Every inn, every courtyard, every rooftop that could legally shelter a human body was occupied. Pilgrims camped in the valleys surrounding the city, the Kidron Valley, the slopes of the Mount of Olives, in makeshift arrangements of canvas and wool and borrowed space. The city's water systems, already strained under normal conditions, were overwhelmed. The markets ran short of bread by midweek. The air was dense with the smoke of thousands of cooking fires and the sound of lambs, hundreds of thousands of lambs, being prepared for the ritual slaughter that was the center of the entire festival. And into this city, a few days earlier, a man from Galilee had entered on a donkey. The Roman prefect Pontius Pilate had also entered Jerusalem that week, but from the opposite direction. Pilate arrived from the west, from Caesarea Maritima on the coast, traveling the main military road with a full cohort of soldiers, horses, armor, standards, the visual vocabulary of imperial power. He came every Passover for exactly this reason: crowd control. The festival was a celebration of Israel's liberation from Egypt, from foreign oppression, from slavery. For a Roman governor managing a restless occupied province, that narrative was volatile. Pilate came to remind the city who held the actual power. His entrance and Jesus' entrance on the same week were not coincidental. The Gospels frame one as a parody of the other, though they don't use that word. One man arrived with cavalry. The other arrived on a borrowed animal, surrounded by people laying cloaks on the ground. The tension in Jerusalem that week was not background texture. It was the entire atmosphere. Every conversation in every market stall, every exchange between priests and merchants in the temple courts, every whispered argument in the narrow residential streets of the upper and lower city, all of it carried the same compressed energy of a place waiting to see what would happen next. Arrests had been made. A man named Barabbas, described by Mark as someone who had committed murder during an insurrection, was already in Roman custody. The chief priests were in active negotiation with the prefect. The city was a room where everyone could smell smoke, but no one was certain where the fire was. This is the city through which Jesus walked on the morning of his execution. The route itself, what later Christian tradition would call the Via Dolorosa, the way of grief, was not a ceremonial path. It was not designated. It was not cleared. It was a series of actual streets, actual alleys, actual stone-paved corridors between actual buildings, all of them crowded with actual human beings going about the compressed chaos of Passover morning. Merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, children, animals. The Roman practice of crucifixion involved forcing the condemned to carry the horizontal beam of the cross, the patibulum, through the city to the execution site. This was not incidental cruelty. It was calculated public theater. The procession was meant to be seen. The degradation was the message. Rome was telling the city, this is what happens. This is what we do to those who disturb the order we maintain. Look, remember, a man who had been flogged, flagellatio, the Roman scourging that preceded crucifixion, and that modern medical analysis describes as capable of exposing muscle and bone, of inducing severe blood loss, of leaving a human body in pre-shock before the execution even began, was being made to carry heavy wood through a city of hundreds of thousands of people, on a festival morning in the heat of a Jerusalem spring. And most of those hundreds of thousands had no idea who he was. That is the detail that changes everything when you sit with it long enough. We read the Passion narrative from the position of people who know the ending. We know the name. We know the significance. We have read the theological interpretations and heard the sermons and seen the artwork. The cross, for modern Christianity, is the central symbol of an entire civilization. It appears on church steeples and hospital walls and jewelry worn close to the skin. It carries 2,000 years of accumulated meaning. But on that morning, on those streets, for the vast majority of people present, what was passing in front of them was a Roman execution procession. Not the first one they had seen, not the last. Crucifixion was a routine instrument of Roman imperial control, used with particular frequency in occupied territories, and Judea, under Roman administration, had seen enough of them that the sight of a condemned man carrying his patibulum through the streets was, for many, simply part of the brutal texture of life under occupation. The Roman soldiers leading the procession were not performing a historic moment. They were doing a job, a specific, procedurally defined job that the army of the most organized military bureaucracy in the ancient world executed with the same methodical efficiency it applied to road construction and supply chain management. There was a centurion in charge. There were soldiers assigned to manage the crowd, to prevent interference, to ensure the condemned reached the execution site. They had done this before. They would do it again. The condemned typically walked. That is another detail that the paintings don't always capture accurately. The patibulum, the crossbeam that would later be attached to the vertical post already fixed at the execution site, weighed somewhere between 40 and 70 kilograms depending on the wood used. For a man already severely weakened by flogging, dehydration, blood loss, and a night without sleep that had included multiple interrogations across different locations, carrying that weight through uneven, crowded streets was not symbolic suffering. It was physiological collapse in slow motion. The Gospel of Luke records that at some point along the route, the soldiers compelled a man named Simon from Cyrene to carry the cross. The other synoptic Gospels record the same detail. They describe him as coming in from the fields, ap agru, from the country, which in the context of Passover morning suggests he was a pilgrim, someone who had camped outside the city walls the previous night, as many did during the festival, and was now entering Jerusalem for the day's observances. Simon of Cyrene did not volunteer. The Greek verb used, agareo, is the same word used elsewhere in the New Testament for the Roman practice of compelling civilians into temporary service. It was a legal right of occupying soldiers, the same right Matthew references in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says that if a soldier compels you to go 1 mile, go 2. It was not an invitation. It was a requirement enforced by the proximity of armed men. Simon was grabbed out of a crowd. He was made to carry the instrument of a stranger's execution through streets packed with festival pilgrims. We do not know what he thought. We do not know if he had ever seen Jesus before, if he had heard him teach, if he knew anything about the man whose wood he was now carrying. Mark's Gospel adds a detail that has fascinated historians and biblical scholars for centuries. It identifies Simon as the father of Alexander and Rufus, 2 names mentioned as if the original readers would know who they were. Paul's letter to the Romans greets a man named Rufus with what sounds like particular warmth. Whether this is the same family, whether Simon's forced participation in this procession became in some way the beginning of a different story for his household, we do not know. The text leaves that door open without walking through it. What we do know is the geography. Golgotha, in Aramaic, Golgotha, in Latin, Calvaria, both meaning skull, was located outside the city walls. This was not incidental. Jewish law required that executions take place outside the boundaries of the city, and Roman practice aligned with this in the case of Judea. The site appears to have been near a main road, which was also deliberate. Crucifixions were positioned where the maximum number of people would pass and see. The pedagogical function of public execution required visibility. Suffering had to have an audience to deliver its message. The streets Jesus walked that morning were not wide. Jerusalem's urban layout in the 1st century was characterized by narrow, winding lanes that followed the natural contours of a hilly terrain, interrupted occasionally by broader market streets and the more organized space of the Temple Mount. The stones were uneven, worn smooth in some places by decades of foot traffic, broken and treacherous in others. There was no drainage system adequate to the density of the population, particularly during festival weeks. The smell of the city at that hour, animal waste, cooking fires, unwashed bodies, incense drifting from the temple across the morning air, the metallic edge of blood from the early morning sacrifices already underway in the temple courts, was not the smell of sacred space in the way we construct it in imagination. It was the smell of a real city, fully alive, completely indifferent to the magnitude of what was moving through its streets. Women are recorded in the Gospels as present along this route. Luke describes a group of women who followed the procession, mourning and lamenting. Jesus, according to Luke's account, turns to address them, an act that requires stopping, or at least slowing, which the soldiers would have had to permit. His words to them are not words of personal farewell. They are prophetic. He speaks of what is coming for Jerusalem, of a destruction so total that those who mourn now will have greater cause to mourn in the days ahead. He is referring, most scholars understand, to the events of 70 AD, still nearly 4 decades in the future from that morning, when the Roman legions under Titus would besiege the city, breach its walls, and burn the temple to its foundation stones. Standing on a road he can barely walk, carrying the accumulated weight of physical devastation, Jesus speaks about the future of a city that is in the process of executing him. That is not the behavior of a man whose mind has collapsed under suffering. That is something else entirely. And the crowd around him, the women weeping, the soldiers watching, the pilgrims pausing to look before continuing toward the temple. None of them had the framework yet to understand what they were seeing. There is a word in the Gospel accounts that most readers pass over too quickly. The word is skull. Golgotha, the place of the skull. Every Gospel that records the crucifixion identifies the execution site by this name, and every reader since has absorbed the name so thoroughly into the larger narrative that it stops registering as a physical description of an actual place. But it was a physical description of an actual place. Scholars have proposed various explanations for the name: that the hill was shaped like a skull when viewed from a distance, that it was a known execution site where bones accumulated, that it referenced some older local tradition now lost to us. What all the explanations agree on is this: it was a place that people recognized. It had a name because it had a history. The people of Jerusalem knew what happened there. When the procession moved through the city gates and approached Golgotha, it was not moving toward an anonymous field. It was moving toward a site that carried the compressed social memory of every execution that had preceded this one. Rome did not rotate its execution sites randomly. Fixed locations served the pedagogical function more effectively. A place that people associated with death, with punishment, with the absolute power of the state. That association deepened with every use. By 33 A.D., Golgotha was already a place whose name meant something specific and terrible to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The vertical post, the stipes, was already there, fixed in the ground, permanent. This is another detail that recalibrates the visual. The cross of popular imagination is a single unified structure, carried whole and erected fresh for each execution. The Roman reality was more efficient and more chilling. The upright post was a fixture of the execution site, reused, worn smooth perhaps by years of use, standing as a permanent installation in the landscape just outside the city walls. The condemned carried only the horizontal beam. When they arrived, the two pieces were assembled. The process was practiced and rapid. The soldiers knew exactly what they were doing. Crucifixion as a method of execution had been refined over centuries of Roman practice, inherited and developed from earlier Phoenician and Persian techniques, optimized not primarily for speed of death, but for maximum suffering at minimum cost and effort. The condemned did not die quickly. That was the point. Death by crucifixion typically came through a combination of exhaustion, asphyxiation, exposure, and cardiovascular collapse, a process that could take hours or, in some recorded cases, days. The position of the body on the cross forced the chest into a configuration that made breathing progressively more difficult. To inhale fully, the condemned had to push upward against the nails in the feet, bearing weight on the most acutely painful points of the body in order to draw the breath needed to remain alive for a few more minutes. It was a machine designed to make survival itself a form of suffering. Roman soldiers stationed at crucifixions were there for the duration. This was their assignment. They divided the condemned man's clothing among themselves. The Gospels record this detail with a specificity that suggests eyewitness proximity, noting that they cast lots for the seamless tunic rather than dividing it. Archaeologists and textile historians have noted that a seamless woven garment of the kind described was not an insignificant piece of clothing. It represented real value. Soldiers gambling over a dying man's clothes at the foot of the cross is not a detail invented for symbolic effect. It is what soldiers in that position would actually do. Above the cross, a wooden board, the titulus, recorded the charge against the condemned. Pilate had composed the inscription himself, and the Gospels record that it was written in 3 languages: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, the 3 languages of that city in that moment. Hebrew for the religious establishment, the language of Torah and temple. Latin for the military and administrative apparatus of Rome. Greek for the wider population, the merchants and pilgrims and diaspora Jews for whom Greek was the common tongue of the Mediterranean world. The charge read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." The chief priests objected to the wording. John's Gospel records that they sent a delegation to Pilate asking him to change it to read that Jesus had claimed to be King of the Jews, rather than stating it as fact. Pilate refused. His answer, "What I have written, is one of the most documented moments of Roman administrative stubbornness in the New Testament. Whether he intended theological significance is unknowable. What is clear is that the inscription remained in 3 languages, visible to everyone who passed along that road for the duration of the execution. Everyone who could read it. And in that multilingual, overcrowded, politically volatile city during the most charged week of the Jewish calendar, nearly everyone could read at least one of those 3 languages. The people who gathered at the site of the crucifixion occupied very different positions relative to what was happening. The Gospel accounts describe Roman soldiers, chief priests and scribes, passers-by, a group of women who had followed from Galilee, and, at least in John's account, the disciple identified as the beloved disciple standing close enough to the cross to receive direct address from Jesus. Think about what it meant to stand close to an active Roman crucifixion. The soldiers were there professionally. They had the protection of their uniform and their weapons and the full authority of the empire. For everyone else, proximity was a statement. In a city under military occupation, during a week of heightened surveillance and political tension, gathering around an executed insurrectionist, for that was how Roman authority had categorized him, the charge was sedition. The claim to kingship was not a neutral act. The disciples had scattered the night before, and the Gospels do not soften this fact. Peter had denied knowing Jesus 3 times before dawn. The 11 had fled. The reasons were not cowardice in the simple sense. They were the rational response to a situation in which association with a condemned man could result in your own arrest. The women stayed. That is a fact recorded across all 4 Gospels, each from a slightly different angle, and it is a fact that historians of the ancient world find entirely consistent with the social dynamics of Roman-occupied Judea. Women occupied a different position in the calculus of Roman threat assessment. A group of women in public mourning at an execution site was not the same political signal as a group of men. It was not invisible, but it was less immediately dangerous. The women who remained near the cross were not passive. They were making the only form of witness available to them within the brutal logic of their circumstances. They were present. They were watching. They were remembering. They would be the first to go to the tomb. There is a moment in the crucifixion narrative that almost every reader encounters and almost no reader fully stops to inhabit. It is the moment of darkness. All 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record that, from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, darkness came over the entire land. 3 hours, from approximately noon to approximately 3 in the afternoon, by the Roman timekeeping system that divided daylight into 12 equal hours regardless of season. The Greek word used, skotos, is the same word used in Genesis when the Septuagint describes the darkness over the face of the deep before creation. It is not a word used lightly in the literary tradition these writers inhabited. Scholars have debated the nature of this darkness for centuries. Some have proposed atmospheric explanations: dust storms from the desert, unusual cloud formations, a localized weather event of the kind the Eastern Mediterranean can produce with dramatic suddenness. Others have noted that a solar eclipse was astronomically impossible at that time, since Passover falls on a full moon, when the moon is on the opposite side of the Earth from the sun, making the geometry of a solar eclipse geometrically excluded. Whatever the physical mechanism, the Gospel writers record it as observable fact, and they record it as meaningful. Not decorative, not symbolic overlay added later, but as something that happened and that the people present experienced. 3 hours of darkness over a city of several 100,000 people during the most sacred festival of the Jewish calendar. Think about what that would have meant to the people standing on that hillside and in those streets. In the ancient world, unusual celestial and atmospheric events were not understood through the framework of meteorology. They were understood as communication. The sky was not background. It was a text that could be read, and in the Hebrew tradition specifically, darkness was a sign of divine presence and divine judgment. Present in the plagues of Egypt, present at Sinai, present in the prophetic language of Amos and Joel and Isaiah when they describe the day of the Lord. The sun will go dark, and the moon will not give its light. These were not metaphors that required scholarly interpretation. Every person in Jerusalem who observed 3 hours of midday darkness had an entire tradition of meaning immediately available to them for understanding what they were seeing. Whatever they made of it in silence and in fear. At the 9th hour, 3 in the afternoon, the Gospels record Jesus crying out in a loud voice. Mark preserves the Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani. Matthew preserves the Hebrew form. Both translate the words immediately. My God, why have you forsaken me? These are the opening words of Psalm 22, a psalm that begins in absolute desolation and moves through suffering toward a resolution that ends in the vindication of the one who cried out. Whether the crowd understood the citation, whether they recognized the psalm, whether they understood the theological weight of a dying man, choosing those particular words from that particular tradition as his final public utterance, the Gospels suggest the crowd did not understand. Some of those standing nearby heard Eloi and thought he was calling for Elijah. They gave him vinegar on a sponge. They watched to see what would happen. What happened was death. The moment of death in Mark's Gospel is described with a stark brevity that resists elaboration, and Jesus breathed his last. 4 words in English for 3 in Greek. The narrative does not slow down to contemplate the significance of what has just occurred. It moves immediately to what happened next. The curtain of the temple was torn in 2 from top to bottom. The earth shook. Rocks split. The centurion standing opposite Jesus, the Roman officer who had overseen the execution with professional efficiency, looked at what he saw, heard the cry, witnessed the death, felt the earth, and said, "Truly this man was the Son of God." A Roman soldier, a man whose career was built on the machinery of imperial power, a man who had nailed people to wood before and would do so again, a man for whom Jewish religious categories were almost certainly foreign concepts. Encountered on assignment in a restless province he probably would rather not have been posted to. This man, standing at the foot of the cross, in the aftermath of a darkness that had lasted 3 hours, after watching a condemned Galilean die the way condemned Galileans died, said the sentence that would become the central confession of a movement that would outlast every empire that had ever existed. He was not a theologian. He was not a disciple. He had not followed Jesus through Galilee, or heard the Sermon on the Mount, or watched the feeding of 5,000 people on a hillside. He had done his job on a Friday afternoon outside Jerusalem, and something about what he witnessed broke through every layer of professional distance he had constructed and produced in him, involuntarily, publicly, in front of his own soldiers, a statement he had not planned to make. The body was taken down before sundown because the law required it. Deuteronomy specified that a body hanged on a tree must not remain there overnight. And the particular urgency of this Passover Sabbath, what John's Gospel calls a great Sabbath, meant that the timeline was compressed. Joseph of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin described by Luke as a good and righteous man who had not consented to the council's decision, went to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate confirmed with the centurion that death had actually occurred. Crucifixion victims sometimes survived longer than expected, and there was a procedure for confirmation, and released the body to Joseph's custody. The tomb was nearby, cut from rock, new, meaning no one had yet been buried in it. The body was wrapped in linen, the face covered with a separate cloth, as was the Jewish custom, and laid inside before the Sabbath began at sundown. The stone was rolled across the entrance. The women who had watched from a distance noted where the tomb was. They would return after the Sabbath to complete the burial preparations they had not had time to finish. They did not know yet what they would find. No one standing on that hillside on Friday afternoon, watching the stone seal the entrance to the tomb, had any framework for what was going to happen next. The disciples were scattered and hiding. The women were grieving. The soldiers had gone back to their barracks. The pilgrims were preparing for the Sabbath. Jerusalem was settling into the particular quiet of a festival evening after a day of unusual and disturbing events. The kind of quiet that is not peaceful but exhausted. A city that had witnessed too much and not yet processed any of it. The road to Golgotha had ended at a sealed stone in a garden, and the world, for one day, did not know that it had just changed entirely. The journey to Golgotha was not a procession designed for contemplation. It was a broken man on broken streets, in a broken city, under a darkening sky, surrounded by people who were afraid and confused and unable to see clearly what was in front of them. It was ordinary and it was catastrophic simultaneously. It was the kind of moment that history rarely recognizes as it is happening, that only reveals its true weight in the decades and centuries that follow, when the ripples have traveled far enough to show you the size of the stone that caused them. Jesus did not walk that road in the amber light of sacred imagination. He walked it in the dust and noise and fear of a real city on a real morning, in a body that was failing, among people who mostly did not understand. And somehow, that makes it more, not less, more concrete, more human, more achingly real. Faith that is rooted in that reality is not fragile. It has been tested against the hardest surfaces of actual history and has not dissolved. That is the road. That is the morning. That is what it cost.